So in today's video, I'm going to show you a fast way to paint a bunch of houses, and by the end, you'll be able to arrange them into a cute town like this. As a bonus, you'll also learn a trick that'll let you turn pretty much anything into a night scene. As always, I'll list all the brushes I'm using for this in the description, but I think you'll be able to follow this video with any brushes you're comfortable with. And the first thing I'm going to do is sketch out a bunch of simple houses. I think 7 or 8 of these will be enough. And I'm going to do them all basically the same height and perspective. And once my sketch is finished, I'm going to make a blank layer. I'll place it underneath my sketch, and I'm going to change the sketch transparency to multiply. Maybe I'll lower it a little bit, and I'm going to make sure I'm painting here from now on below the sketch. And since this kind of illustration is very complicated with rows and rows of houses, I recommend painting the individual houses very simply and loosely. So to do that, I'm going to change my brush to the hard edge round brush. And I'm going to use basically any colors, but I want to kind of focus on these sort of warm brick tones. And the first thing I'm going to do is fill out a silhouette of the house. And to make it more interesting, I'm going to go out of my way to make it a little bit blotchy. There we go. Next, I'm going to do the roof, which is usually going to be a darker, colder gray tone. And once the roof is finished, I'm going to use the eraser brush, set to the fine liner pen, to very, very loosely kind of clean up the outlines here. And after that, I'm going to continue with the hard edge round brush at a slightly smaller size, and I'm going to use it to fill out all the details on the house. And once again, I'm trying to do this as loose as I can. And this looks pretty good, but I think I want to darken the roof a little bit, so I'm going to paint over it again with a darker shade. There we go, and then I can move on to adding some textures. Now every house doesn't have to have a texture, but I want to show you an easy way to give this a kind of brick effect. So I'll make a blank layer above my house. I'm going to choose pure white. I'm using the same hard edge round brush, and I'm just going to draw some bricks like this. Then I can lower the opacity of this brick layer and set it to a point where it's just barely visible. There we go. And then I'll merge it together with the house layer. Another thing you might want to do is add a little bit of shading. So for that, I'm going to use the freehand selection tool. I just want to kind of darken this one side here. And I can do that with the hue, saturation, and brightness. There we go. And of course, the last thing I'm going to do is add a chimney. And for some of these houses, I like to do a kind of base of the chimney that's the same color as the main body of the house. And I'll just make a shape like that. And then I'll use a slightly darker grayer tone to do the actual kind of stacks here. And that's basically the whole process for painting the houses. So at this point, I'm just going to quickly fast forward through this and paint the rest of them. I do want to point out that most of the houses are very simple, but I will kind of do a few super detailed houses just to make the illustration have more variety. And once all the houses are painted in like this, I don't need the sketch anymore, so I'm just going to delete it. And all my houses so far are on this one layer. Now, I want to basically rearrange these houses into 3 different rows, and each row has maybe 4 to 5 houses in it. And I've done this a number of different ways, but I think the easiest way is to just create 3 copies of our house layer. So 1 copy for each row. I'm going to turn off the ones I'm not using and just work on 1 layer at a time. And I'm just going to use the freehand selection tool to kind of select the houses individually and then position them using the arrow tool. And since we've got 8 houses, but I only need 4 or 5 for each row, I'm just going to drop the houses I don't want to use off the edge of the artboard to delete them. And once I've made my first row, I'm going to turn the layer for that off, turn on the next kind of house collection here, and then use the same process to create another row, just trying to use a different arrangement and selection of houses. And once the second row is finished, I'm going to turn the layer for the first row back on. I think this turned out pretty good, but these two are bugging me a little bit. So I think what I'll do is kind of mess with the hue and brightness of this house to make it look more different. So I'm going to make sure that layer is selected. Then I can use the freehand selection tool to isolate this house, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just mess with this a little bit. And once I'm happy with that, I'm going to turn off the first and the second row, turn on the final kind of house collection, and use the selection tool once again to create a nice arrangement. And once the last row is finished, I'm going to turn the other rows back on, and I'm going to use the arrow tool to move them around and overlap them a little bit, but in some cases I will have to change the layer order. Now this next step here is very optional, but I do like to give each row of houses a little bit of a skew. So to do that, I'm going to select a row. In this case it's the top one. I'm going to use the arrow tool, set to distort, and I'm just going to use the middle blue node to kind of drag it forward and tip the houses a little bit. There we go. And then I'll go to the next row and basically do it in the opposite direction. And so far, this arrangement of houses looks pretty good, but there's a couple of issues I want to fix. The first one is these two houses. I think they look too similar, so I'm going to use the same technique I used earlier and just shift the hue and brightness of this house down here to change it. There we go. The next issue I want to fix is kind of a contrast issue. I feel like this house color is too similar to the roof, so I want to add a shadow there in the back. So I'm going to make sure this row of houses is selected. Then again, I'll use the freehand selection tool. I'm just going to select the area where I want there to be a shadow. I'll feather it out to soften it, and then I'll just darken it using hue, saturation, and brightness. And the last issue I want to show you how to fix is a transparency thing. It looks like it didn't happen very often, but you can definitely see this house showing through this one. And I think the best solution is to just select this row and then erase that area. So I'll make sure that layer is selected. Then I can use the eraser brush and just erase it where it's showing through. And once all those issues are fixed, I'm going to merge all three layers for the rows of houses together onto one layer. Then I'll make a layer above it, and this is where I'm going to start painting the smoke coming out of the chimneys. So for that, I'm going to choose a very light warm gray tone. And for the brush, I want to use a default Procreate brush. It's in the drawing tab here and it's called gloaming. And this is what I'm going to use to make the smoke. And the reason I did the smoke on its own layer is so I can kind of adjust it after the fact. In this case, it looks a little bit too dark, so I'm going to make sure the smoke layer is selected, and then I can just lighten it a little bit. After that, I want to add a couple of trees, so I'm going to make a new layer for that, but I'm going to make sure it's below the smoke but above the houses. And I think I'm just going to paint a couple of kind of oak or maple trees. So I'm going to select a green color like this. For the brush, I'm going to stay in the drawing tab, but change to the Morilla brush. And I think it's easier to kind of make a tree over here in the kind of a blank area. And I'll just make it like this. After that, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, which is still set to the fine liner pen, and I'm going to use it to kind of cut this into a nice shape. And for the trunk, I'm going to use a very light, kind of warm khaki tone. I'm going to change to the little pine brush and just draw them in like this. And you could definitely use this technique to create a bunch of different trees, but to save time, I'm just going to copy and paste this same tree. So I'm going to grab the arrow tool, and I'll just move it into position somewhere out here. There we go. Then I'll duplicate it. And I think I'll kind of warp the duplicate so it looks a little bit different. And I'll move it into a different position. And I think this last one, I might also shift the hue as well, just to differentiate it. And once the trees are finished, I'm going to merge all the layers for them together onto one. And then I'm going to use the eraser brush to kind of erase them back where they should be covered up by the houses in front. But it's a little bit hard to see, so just temporarily I'm going to lower the opacity of the tree layer. and then just kind of erase it here where it should be covered up. And of course, once that's finished, I'll set the opacity back to 100. Now, depending on your project, this could be enough houses, but I want to double it and create a kind of long, skinny illustration. So to do that, I'm going to merge everything so far onto one layer. Then I'm going to scale it a little bit smaller and position it near the top, just making sure I don't accidentally go kind of beyond the edge of the artboard. Then I'll duplicate it, I'll move the copy down, and then I'm going to flip it horizontal so the houses are kind of facing the other way, and this helps kind of reduce the copy-paste effect. And if you want to, you can kind of shift the hue of one of the copies to make it look more different as well. So at this point, our town could be done, and this is what it would look like. But before I go, I wanted to show you how to easily transform this into a night scene. It only takes about a minute, and I think in general, it's just a great technique to know about. And to get this night effect, the first thing I want to do is make sure everything is on one layer. I've got two layers because I copied it and duplicated it, so I'll merge them together like this. Then I'm going to go to my hue, saturation, and brightness, and just slightly desaturate our town here. There we go. After that, I'm going to make a blank layer above our town, and I'm going to use a kind of medium blue tone, and I'm going to drag it and fill that whole layer out. So you can see in the layers panel, it's just basically a blue layer, and I'm going to change the transparency mode to vivid light. There we go. After that, I'm going to make sure our blue layer is still selected. I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm going to mess with this a little bit and try to adjust the colors so this looks more like a night scene. Next, I want to add a kind of glowing window effect. So to do that, I'll make another layer above everything so far, and I'm going to use a very bright saturated yellow color. For the brush, I'm going to use the hard edge round again, and I'm going to fill in maybe 20 or 30% of these windows. After that, I'm going to change the transparency mode of my kind of glowing layer to vivid light as well. There we go. And then I'm going to create a duplicate of it, and I'm going to select the original one, the lower one, and I'm going to give it a Gaussian blur like this. I think around 10 or 12% is good. After that, I'm going to kind of adjust the opacity of these layers and try to dial them in so it looks right. And there we go. That's pretty much the same process I'd use to turn any daytime scene into a night scene. If you think I've earned it, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. And finally, here are 2 more house-related watercolor tutorials that you might like to watch next.